Our chalice lighting words, which Deborah Weiss shared with us today, are those of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They come from his landmark letter from the Birmingham jail, written while he was incarcerated in Alabama in April of 1963. The letter would become a lightning rod and a moral argument for the civil rights movement. Dr. King was not only brilliant in his argument for civil disobedience through nonviolent direct action, but also for giving a crystal clear picture of the violent and debasing oppression inflicted by the political will of white citizens upon Black citizens in the South. This was known as Jim Crow. Dr. King had been arrested for planning a march without a permit. He hadn't actually done anything yet. But while he was in jail, he wrote a letter in response to an open letter from several clergymen of Birmingham, including a rabbi, who criticized King's tactics, stating that civil rights ought to be fought out in the courts, not through community organizing and demonstrating. King began writing his response in the margins of the newspaper article that had been snuck into him by a jail trustee. He continued writing on every scrap of paper he could find, and then finally his attorneys brought in a writing pad for him. The whole of Dr. King's response was just under 7,000 words. 7,000 brilliant words, in my opinion. His letter was eventually published by several outlets, including the Christian Century and the Atlantic Monthly. And of course, you know that in this letter, in his I Have a Dream speech and the work that he did in civil rights, he was awarded a Nobel Prize for Peace. The letter from the Birmingham jail preceded Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama by 2 years. When Dr. King called on the country's clergy to help make the march from Selma to Montgomery happen, more Unitarian Universalist clergy than any other denomination showed up. Of course, we know that Unitarian minister James Reeb and a Unitarian layperson, Viola Liuzzo, were martyred in the course of events that surrounded the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. But I've often wondered why there was such an overwhelming response by UU clergy and laity to King's call. For the clergy, I believe Dr. King's letter of 2 years before not only made an impression on them, but his concepts of a network of mutuality. All life is interrelated. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This idea that we're all connected. This would have resonated with Unitarian Universalist clergy and some laity who were inspired to go to Selma in 1965. I have often thought, or I had often thought, by his use, Dr. King's use of Theodore Parker's words, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Those are the words of 19th century Unitarian theologian Theodore Parker. it's obvious that he had to have some brush with Unitarianism. And this would be confirmed long after Dr. King died, when by chance, Rosemary Bray McNatt interviewed Coretta Scott King in the mid-1990s. The Reverend Dr. Bray McNatt became a UU minister and is now president of the Starr King School of Ministry. But when she interviewed Mrs. King, Bray McNatt was a journalist attending seminary. And this is what she says about her interview with Mrs. King. During an hour of wide-ranging conversation, I mentioned to her that I was in seminary to become a Unitarian Universalist minister. What frankly surprised me, Dr. Bray McNatt said, was the look she gave me, one of respect and delight. "Oh," said Mrs. King, "I went to Unitarian churches for years, even before I met Martin. And Martin and I went to Unitarian churches when we were in Boston." "We gave a lot of thought," Mrs. King said, "to becoming Unitarian at one time, but Martin and I realized we could never build a mass movement of Black people if we were Unitarian." So as Dr. Bray McNatt says in this article that she wrote for the UU World in 2002, she said she was surprised, delighted, and then a bit saddened by what Mrs. King revealed. And I have to say I feel the same way. But Dr. Bray McNatt, who still is, she's president of Starr King Seminary, and so she's still very much a part of our faith tradition, but is a realist in the sense that our Unitarian Universalist faith, our institution, is comprised of members, mostly of members of the dominant culture. And so what the Kings knew is still true today, that most of us, as white European ethnicity, occupying the middle classes, we don't share the same experience in our society on a daily basis as those people of color and non-European ethnicity. Of course, there are exceptions all around, but in general, as a people of privilege, we get through a day without much of a problem. The same is not true for those across the board, people of color who live on the margins and have not very much power in our society. So as highly educated rationalists, we tend to overlook the dark side of humanity that we don't experience very often. It's difficult to see and acknowledge human constructs of evil that exist in our own backyard, like currently, contemporarily, school-to-prison pipelines, the Black youth, mass incarceration of men of color, and the continuing erosion of voting rights among marginalized peoples. So if we are to put our ideals and our words into actions, we as UUs are called to first peer unblinkingly at proof positive evidence of structural racism in this society. We need to pull back the curtain on spurious rhetoric like voter fraud, critical race theory in school curricula. And we must educate ourselves about these issues and be brave enough to engage self-examination about our own biases and how we unwittingly, as well-intended as we are as Unitarian Universalists, we have to examine how we're complicit in unfair systems, like saying, well, just fight it out in court. Well, our judicial system is not equitable. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from 4 of your fellow members of this fellowship, and they're going to share their stories of how their awareness and their consciousness was raised, either by learning or doing the work of justice. Each were called by our 7 principles, and in their own life experiences, they learned how to resist systems of injustice that oppress and marginalize those with whom we share an inescapable network of mutuality. Theoretically, most of us think, yes, acknowledge, yes, we're connected. What we do affects the environment, what we do affects other people. So if we believe that, we must know that we share in this mutuality. Let us engage that work that allows others to be who they ought to be, so that each of us can be who we ought to be, mutually creators and builders of beloved community. I call Jim Smith.
In 2015, I visited the Michael Brown shooting site in Ferguson, Missouri, with members of the Beach Board and staff at the UU congregation at Shelter Rock. We funded nonprofits in St. Louis, including the Organization for Black Struggle. When I came home, I vowed I would devote the rest of my life as an activist to racial justice. I had run programs in the church on homelessness, domestic violence, human rights, peace, veterans issues, corporate responsibility, cyberbullying, teen suicide, the evils of Walmart, and affordable housing. But I was so shocked by the numbers of unarmed Black men and women shot by police that I realized something was drastically wrong. I educated myself about structural racism, reading 15 books on the subject. I learned about Jim Crow laws, government complicity in segregation, redlining, federal mortgage granting, 98% of which went to whites, the Tulsa massacre, steering by realtors, the relationship between housing and the quality of education in a school district. I advocated at my Lily White High School for creation of a diversity task force and volunteered to lead it. Of course, the Marianist brothers refused. I joined the Racial Justice Subcommittee at Shelter Rock and the board at a nonprofit called Erase Racism. I showed up at affordable housing demonstrations, pulled out weeds in a community garden, drove with my wife Lynn in a car caravan to protest the killing of George Floyd. I advocated for ratification of the 8th principle at Shelter Rock until it was ratified. I donated to organizations providing hunger relief, shelters, and advocacy. I was interviewed by a TV reporter at a meeting condemning hate. She asked why I attended the almost all-Black gathering, and I said, to help give a voice to folks who usually don't have one. For years at General Assemblies, presenters at workshops have suggested that you use Learn to be white allies and not try to lead the band. So my mantra in working with people of color has been, what do you need? How can I help? I'm looking to use my status as a white person to support their struggles. How has this work affected my life? Well, it gives me more satisfaction than I used to get by playing golf 10 times a month or scoring goals in my weekly ice hockey games. In Florida, I've traveled to the Glades, connected with activists, helped organize a June 23, 2021 worship service here with Black Lives Matter, advocated for the eighth principle, ran into some roadblocks on that one, supported Sierra Club's Stop the Burn campaign to urge a transition to green harvesting, run a Zoom panel last April 30th on sugarcane burning and its effect on minority communities. I've toured the fields, smelled the smoke and ash that wafts over their neighborhoods when the cane is burned. And thanks to Barbara Messick's referral to her son, Graham, I've briefed a 60 Minutes producer who says he's interested in investigating the story. What would success look like? It would be an agreement between the sugarcane farm owners, the refiners, and advocates to create a 30-mile buffer zone around communities of color and to agree to a gradual transition to green harvesting in Florida. If Brazil can do it, why can't we? In Boca City, I've attended tenants and housing authority meetings at Dixie Manor, whose 95 units are to be demolished and residents relocated, to make sure that city officials guarantee that everybody who wants to return after the project is completed can do so. And I've reported to our Healing Justice Committee. And I helped run a worship service here with tenants last year and been pleased that the city has applied to the state for $20 million in funding and has approved a loan guarantee for the project. Meanwhile, 4 advocates, some of which we took to lunch here last year, were appointed to the board. So now African Americans actually have a 4-3 majority on the housing board. Success to me would be that the authority follows through on its promises. I've been proud to wear my FBR name tag at meetings, shake hands with officials, and tell them about our congregation when they ask me, what the heck are you doing here? Tomorrow, I'll be marching with Lynn in Boca's MLK parade for the 2nd time. I'm just getting started.
Hi, I'm Lynn Smith. In earning my master's degree in social work, I learned how to be in relationship with people, all people. This meant unlearning some of the ideas I grew up with. It was not easy. In fact, it was sort of painful. I had been raised by my grandparents in a small town in central New Jersey. I was taught by them and the society that I was immersed in that each type or group of people belonged together, and it was in our best interest to keep it that way. We were supposed to stay with our own kind and keep in our own box. It was the same at places of worship. They had become the most segregated places in our town and in America. Fast forward many years to moving to cosmopolitan Long Island, where there were more visible differences of ethnic culture, skin culture, food and music, but still at the end of every day, everyone went home to their boxed neighborhoods where they lived, shopped, and worshiped with their own kind. I accepted these norms until Jim and I learned we could not have a child and decided to adopt. During the process, Jim and I learned of the breadth of ethnicity and the health of babies in the New York foster care system and in adoption agencies. We had to agonize over what babies were too dark, which were too damaged, who were too different from us. In the end, we adopted a boy born to a German English mother and a Cuban father. We made a conscious effort to learn about Cuban culture and always chose to connect him with his Hispanic heritage, whether he wanted it or not. We moved into a mainly Hispanic and Portuguese neighborhood and enrolled him in a private Quaker school in which the students were more than 50% children of color. There was an obvious need to do this because people often made comments about the color of his eyes or hair, or how he looked more like his babysitter, who was a woman of color, than me. And then came the challenge of finding a Sunday school. After much searching, we found the local UU congregation, which was a blessing for us as a family. The principals gave us a structure to live by. In 2016, our UU congregation learned about structural racism. At first, it was very difficult to admit that my passionate liberal self might have a hidden bias. But in our very first workshop entitled How to Be a White Ally, I had to admit that I could hide my Jewish identity behind my married name of Smith and my white skin. Whenever I needed to do that, I could do it. In fact, in the group, one of the first exercises was to imagine times in your life when you've presented yourself as someone else, someone with lighter skin, more pious, or more Christian abiding, or more able-bodied, or dressed in a way that you didn't show any ethnicity about yourself. I remembered school or club applications and job interviews in which I acted out a role so that I could appear more acceptable to the interviewer. It was then that I realized that you can only do this passing if your skin is white. It was a powerful realization to me that continues to bring me new awareness all the time with whomever I meet. In my daily life, I make sure I see and acknowledge those who are different from me in appearance. I try to model this as an ethic of desegregation, not color blindness, by seeking out diversity or difference, someone who's different, and trying to learn about them and celebrate with them. I look forward to a life in which our son's skin color or anyone's skin color is no longer a liability, a life in which we live in boxes no more. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Deborah Weiss. It's so nice to be back in person. This is my first time since COVID. It's nice to see familiar faces in person instead of just on a screen. My interest or passion for social justice began in childhood. I grew up in Chicago, which had the notoriety of being one of the most segregated northern cities, which I found appalling from a very young age. And in middle school, I had the opportunity to do an exchange at an all-Black high school on the South Side, and it had a very big change. It affected my life permanently. I really loved it. I learned a lot, and I saw, you can read something, but when you see it, it's different. I also am old enough that I remember seeing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking on TV, and he was just mesmerizing. So in my life, I had a long career as a choreographer director, as you know, and I often did programs on themes of social justice, women's rights, and in fact, the abolition and the women's suffrage movement were intimately connected, as you saw in the program that I did with Judy Kaiser and others a couple of years ago for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. But I came to UUFBR in 2016 when FAU, where I was teaching, sent me here to be a project manager for an environmental justice initiative called Rising Together. Environmental justice, or EJ, grew out of the civil rights movement. It states that all people should be afforded equal environmental protection, which is usually not the case. Hazardous waste dumping occurs in poor neighborhoods of color and so on. So anyway, during the course of doing this grant, which we surveyed 2 vulnerable coastal communities of color, I became involved with the Pearl City community, and specifically with DISC, Developing Interracial Social Change. And the then president, Alan Willis, asked me to march with them on Martin Luther King Day 2017, and I did, and this grant was done through UUFBR, as you know. So I marched with them, and we got to Sanford Square, and he and Marjorie O'Sullivan, the longtime treasurer, said, Deborah, please, would you start a program, a free after-school program like you did in Nyack, New York? My program used themes of social justice, tolerance, acceptance, using musical theater. I think if you make a message appealing and engaging, you can get young people on board, and young people are our future. And that has been what I've devoted my career to, young people, at-risk youth, from middle school through high school. So I said, sure, if there's an interest. And I then canvassed all the agencies that serve youth. They all wanted it, especially for middle school kids. And then I talked to Reverend Harris here at UUFBR, and she said, talk to the endowment committee, they'll help you. And thank you very much, endowment committee members who sponsored this program, gave us seed money. We started it in March of 2017, and we adapted numbers. I adapted numbers from different Broadway shows, such as Hairspray, which talks about integration, body acceptance, tolerance, diversity. And so without preaching, we did it through the arts, engaging children. They performed at Martin Luther King Day, at Willow Theater, in Hughes Park. They came here for a healing justice service. They were at the Boca Raton Museum. It's been a very wonderful project. Now, during COVID, we shut down. So I taught on Zoom and Google Meets, but it was limited as to what you could do in that medium. So I created a video with the help of Ron Roth from UUFBR, which is still on my website, deborahweissdance.org/programs, showing highlights of past MLK. And I always start with a tribute to Dr. King himself. And the video also includes a tribute to John Lewis, who had died shortly before we made it. During COVID, then, we decided, let's take the program outside and let's address some serious problems that are affecting poor communities during COVID. Increasing BMI, body mass index, I'm also a health educator, poor nutrition, lack of fruit and vegetable consumption. One of my mentors at Columbia University, where I did my master's and doctorate, was Dr. Contento, the head of nutrition, and she did a whole project in Harlem that increased fruit and vegetable consumption. And I followed her, and I created the Healthy Snacks No Cook Cookbook with the kids this past year. The kids have been gardening in Allen's Place, Pearl City Community Garden, which DISC started in 2021. And I was on the board of DISC for several years. I helped them with that. And the dance company purchased a planting bed that is donated solely to the Pearl City youth. It's been primarily the kids from Dixie Manor, the Lois Martin kids, but other groups have come as well, and they learn gardening from the 2 DISC gardeners, and then they keep whatever produce they grow. But it's not so easy to change eating habits, and not just poor people. A lot of Americans have very poor eating habits, as you know. So by doing these snacks, this was my concept, we expanded our dance program to be something I call healthy living. So I taught nutrition, and we made these snacks. So who could resist a mandarin pepper lion, for example, and I made it with the kids and they ate it. And the kids performed this last Thursday at Lois Martin Community Center. They did a dance called Plant a Radish from the Fantastics. Some of you may remember that show. It ran off Broadway for 30 plus years. And it's a song about vegetables and gardening. And I actually, shortly before we did our performance, we made the last snack in this book, a kale clown. I had these kids eating raw kale. I was amazed, as well as all the other ingredients. Kale is the most nutrient-dense food on the planet. And, blindness, there's 6 times the rates of blindness in poor Black communities compared to other communities because of complications from diabetes and other things associated with poverty and inadequate access to healthcare. All these veggies keep your eyesight healthy, keep your body healthy, help to ward off hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, and other diseases that plague poor communities of color, especially African American communities. So I'm very proud of this. The kids all got a free copy of this and took it home. They performed, and we have older kids coming tomorrow, teenagers from the Gifted and Talented High School and from Palm Beach State College, the Black Student Union. And we're going to be teaching the audience Plant a Radish. It's a very simple dance. I want you to all join in. And please come to the march. If you can't march, you can always take the free trolley. It starts tomorrow, as it has every year, with a free breakfast at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And for those of you that might not know, the monument is on the grounds, the King Monument is on the grounds of the church, as is the garden. It's quite a substantial property. And then if you feel like marching, if you are strong enough and healthy enough, please join us on the march. We will be carrying banners and signs. And then if you don't feel up to marching, take the trolley over to Meisner Park. This year, the location is slightly different. It was in Sanford Square, then for several years it was in Meisner Park in the East Lot. It is not going to be in the East Lot. It's going to be in front of the big amphitheater stage near the clock tower on the portable stage that the city sets up. And it's going to be the same format as it was a couple of years ago, where they have a ceremony on the stage, the mayor, keynote, BRCA, the clergy, and then a humanitarian award. And at the end of that, they're going to clear the stage, have a short break, and then the community performances, including ours. So I hope you'll stay for the whole event. We don't know the exact timetable because we never know exactly how long it's going to take people to settle down after the march, but they are projecting that the ceremony will start around 10:30, 10:40, and it'll last about an hour, followed by a 15-minute break. So this timetable might be a little off. I think the community performances will be starting around 12, not 12:30. There'll be refreshments, a carnival, rides, so bring your grandchildren and young people. And there are flyers outside. I have some more flyers if anybody needs them. And I hope you'll all join us. Thank you so much.
Hi, all. This is also my first time back with the congregation since COVID began. So, thank you. I'm going to try to be somewhat brief here. I want to tell you about me and how I came to do some of the work that I do and how I came to be where I am now. And I realized that this has been a back and forth process all the way along. Starting with fear. Nearly 10 years ago, UUFBR was invited to participate in a workshop on racism. And it was held by Cherry Steinwinder out of Houston, Texas. As I look at you, I see many of you who came to those sessions that we had later. It turned out to be an absolutely stellar performance, but if I had been left to myself, I probably would not have gone. I ended up calling Cherry. I called my friend Louise, who said, I'm going. And I ended up saying, I'm going too. I was anxious about it, and I really didn't know why. And I thought about later. I didn't have any reason to be anxious. I'd had a lot of experience with people who are different races, different economic backgrounds. I was an Army brat. I was all over the United States. I lived among lower income people in California, Texas, New Mexico. I actually lived in a project. And I went to a school where everybody was Hispanic when I was in 3rd grade. And I was very often the odd man out. And when I was in 4th grade in El Paso, I was taken down on the playground by some gang boys. They were Mexican gang boys wearing black jackets, and they scared me to death, and they threatened my brother. They said my brother was in 2 grades below me, and they said if he moved and tried to go tell somebody or get some help, they'd kill him. And he froze. And I was saying to him, go get help, and he didn't. So eventually somebody came walking by the playground, and I think the boys got scared and they ran off, and I was okay. But that fear persisted into high school. And I went to Austin High School in Texas. And I remember thinking the brown boys in the black jackets ruled the center of the hallway, and I would walk off to the side. I never walked down the center because they had the center. So as I moved into adulthood, I went to the University of Arizona, and we did things like go across the border to Nogales, and I began to meet people who were different. They were actually people who lived everyday lives. And in the living of everyday lives, they told us about that. I also worked on the Papago Indian Reservation, and we tried to teach them about Western medicine. They had their own medicine that worked quite well, but we never asked them. We just told them what we thought was best. So I already told you we did 2 workshops after we went to this. This workshop turned out to be absolutely stellar. But Cherry began the workshop like she always did. And she began it by saying, what do you hope? Who are you? Why are you here? And what are you concerned about? And as it came my turn to talk about what are you concerned about, I found myself thinking, would I be honest? Would I not be honest? What am I going to do here? And what I ended up saying is, I'm afraid somebody's going to call me a racist, that I'm going to learn that I am racist, and I don't want to be. And it was really funny. The anxiety began to go down. During the workshop, I learned an awful lot, one about structural racism, but all different kinds of racism. And the one that concerns me most is the one that is deep inside me, that sort of says, you're different. We're the same, but we're different. And one of my super good friends from Berlin, Germany, Louis was a colonel in the Army. Well, he wasn't then, he was a captain, I think. My husband was the captain. My mother was dying, and Betty Dix, who is Black, helped me immeasurably with what was going on in my family. And she took care of my young son, who was 3 at the time. And she actually just came to my husband's memorial service. He just died. And she has been a super good friend. I learned which bathrooms you go to, which bathrooms you don't go to. I learned not to wear T-shirts that exemplify racism. I learned all kinds of things, and we were able to talk together. And she learned things from me. When you're welcome, she tested me out to see if she was welcome to come into my home. And it turns out, yeah, you are, come on in. But I didn't know that, and we didn't know it until we talked together. So there's an honesty that begins to go back and forth as you begin to open your doors. So how did all this affect me? I'm more easy now with dealing with racism. I'm more easy to talking about it. And one of the things that I want to tell you, because I'm running out of my time here, I want to tell you so much more, because my life has been this back and forth thing. But what I want to do is invite you all to come and join us at Healing Justice meetings. This is where we do the kinds of things we do. We actually look at how we honor our UUU principles. Lately at UUFBR, we've been going more inward and learning about what it means to be a UU through widening our consciousness and deepening our understanding. The other side of this is inspired consciousness, how we reach out to our communities. And you've heard both kinds of things, how we grow inside and how we grow to helping people outside. But we try to help when we are asked. We don't just walk in and make assumptions. That's important. So this is a dance that we continue to develop between learning and doing. All of you are welcome to join us as we figure out who we are and we do the deepening work of healing justice. We meet on Zoom every fourth Tuesday and watch the e-blast, and it will tell you when we meet. And we'd like to invite you to join us. Please do. And my friend Louisa Malusas, thank you for helping me get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your stories and your inspirations.